Presently, I'm an assistant professor in orthopedics at MMC. So, since our topic today is about peripheral nerve injuries, the initial few slides will be about introduction, and then we will go into the depth of the subject. Okay, this is just a brief review about the peripheral nervous system. You all know this. It has got two different limbs: the afferent limb and the efferent limb. The afferent limb is somatic, sensory, and visceral sensory. The efferent limb is somatic nervous and autonomic nervous system, which is subdivided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. I don't want to go into the depth of these because these are more of neurology related topics. And this picture gives the anatomical structure of a single nerve cell. You all know this, and I'm sure about it. So this is the cell body, the dendrites arising from it, and the axon, which is covered with myelin, traveling towards its end organ. Now, with regards to myelination, why it is important here? If you consider this brown line as an unmyelinated nerve, this is how a nerve impulse travels in it. In one direction, it has got its own speed. But consider this as a myelinated axon, and if you see the conduction here, you can look that it is very rapid and fast when compared to the unmyelinated nerve. This is because the impulse doesn't travel along the axon, but it jumps from one node to the other node. Hope you all are aware that these are called nodes of Wrangler. So this is called saltatory conduction. In case of nerve injuries, the initial assault is demyelination. The axon loses its myelin sheath, which leads to conduction block. Now, this is a cut section of the peripheral nerve, and this picture you all must be aware that any peripheral nerve has got, it actually arises from the spinal column, with the motor roots from the anterior gray matter and the sensory nerve roots entering into the posterior column. And we have the dorsal ganglion here, which actually comprises the cell body of the sensory neurons. Now, in cut section of nerve, you can see that a single axon, as shown here, is covered by the myelin sheath provided by the Schwann cell, and which in turn is covered by the endonuria. This is the single most important functional unit. A group of these axons together form a fascicle, which is surrounded by the perinuria. And a group of fascicles together actually form the peripheral nerve, which are bounded together by the epinuria. Now, this diagram is very important in order to understand the severity of injury when it comes to the peripheral nerve. Now, what are the causes for peripheral nerve injury? The first and most important cause is ischemia. Otherwise, lack of blood supply to that particular nerve. It can happen due to any reason, and it may be an injury, a fracture causing kinking of the vessel, or a dislocation. Anything may cause this ischemia. The other important thing is compression. Can anybody identify what this device is actually? Anyone? Because we keep the class to be interactive. Any volunteer?
BP apparatus.
Sorry? And can you please come again?
BP apparatus.
BP apparatus. Okay, fine. An apparatus very similar to the BP apparatus, where we usually use the Ribera-Rossi cuff. Hope you remember that. This is actually a tourniquet where we use it during surgeries. Now, if you look carefully in this picture, you can see that the part of the limb which is proximal to this tourniquet is actually a bit pink, whereas the part of the limb which is distal to the tourniquet is more of a, it's more blanched. Otherwise, the blood supply here is cut off. Now, this instrument is used to provide bloodless surgical field to the surgeon, who can operate without the hindrance of bleeding into the operative site. So this is a tourniquet, which is actually very similar to the BP cuff, which you had said just now. And the problem here is, this actually causes compression to occlude the vessel. Now, any nerve or vessel can tolerate compression, but to a certain extent. When the pressure exceeds, or the time it can tolerate exceeds, then it leads to nerve injury. This is another form of compression. Can you recognize this phenomenon? We popularly use a term for it.
Saturday night paralysis.
Saturday night paralysis.
Yeah, very good. Saturday night paralysis. A person in an inebriated condition sleeps with his limb. It may be either upper limb or lower limb, it can happen anywhere. Most commonly, it is the upper limb. the limb dangles outside from the edge of the bed. And here the nerve compression occurs, leading on to problems. And anybody can identify what is shown in this picture? Yeah, crutch.
Crutch palsy.
Very good. There is a proper way to use a crutch. If the individual using a crutch doesn't use it in the proper manner, it causes abnormal pressure in the axilla. Usually, when they use it properly, the entire force of the body is transmitted to this handle, and this is only given as a support or a lever to adjust the position of the crutch. But there should not be any pressure of this crutch into the axilla. Suppose if it's a very elderly individual or an individual who doesn't know how to use it appropriately, they will definitely cause pressure here, and this will lead to crutch palsy. And this is a traction injury. Suppose if a person is falling from height and suddenly he grabs an object to prevent that fall, it causes a sudden traction in the nerve tracts, and this leads to nerve injury. This is very clear, open wound, a total cut wound of the nerve. Not only the nerve, all other vital structures. And burns. Burns can also cause nerve damage because of the heat may penetrate beyond the skin and reach the nerves which are immediately beneath the skin. So how we classify nerve injuries? Hope you all aware of this sitting position. What it is called as? What do we call this as? Anybody? It's called a sitting cross-leg. Hope you have heard it in your clinical sessions, right? And I'm sure any person can sit in this position if they don't have a pathology in their spine, hips, or knees. They can sit comfortably, but for how long? Maybe some 5 to 10 minutes. But after that, something called as transient nerve ischemia happens. This is the least severe nerve injury possible, and this is actually a very benign condition, which we also call as a sleeping limb. Now, if you remember this slide, in cross-sectional anatomy, you can see that there are some blood vessels running in the perineural tissue, which actually ramify extensively to reach to the level of the axon to provide blood supply to it. Now, here when we sit in this position, because of the compression, which is not very severe enough, but it is enough to cause endoneural anoxia or collapse of these vessels, this phenomenon happens. If you sit in this position, maybe about 15 minutes, you will start to feel numbness and tingling. By about 30 minutes, you will lose the pain sensibility. Sometimes I think we may even get confused which of our legs is actually touching the floor and which is on the opposite, which is on the leg beneath it. And about 40 minutes time, you will start to feel muscle weakness. But on relief of compression, everything is restored back to normal. Sensation is restored within 30 seconds. The sensation of pins and needles may last for about 10 minutes, and that too goes away. And full muscle power comes back in 10 minutes time. So this is the least possible nerve injury that can happen. Anybody have experienced this? I think most of us must have. Okay, we'll proceed further. Now there is a classification method for peripheral nerve injuries. The most popularly described are two. One is Seddon's classification and another is Sunderland's classification. In Seddon's classification, you can see that the first picture shows a normal conduction mechanism. The second picture is neuropraxia. Otherwise, there is not much of an anatomical disturbance, but there is a conduction block. Whereas in axonotmesis, there is disruption of the axon. In neurotmesis, there is disruption of the entire nerve. And still more elaborate is the Sunderland's classification. If we compare these two, I think it will be clearly depicted in this picture. It comprises of grades from 1 to 5. 1 is equivalent to Seddon's neuropraxia, where there is just only ionic block or maybe a possible segmental demyelination, nothing more than that, and the recovery potential is full. Whereas in grade 2, there is axon loss, which is equivalent to the axonotmesis by Seddon. Here the axon is severe, but the endoneural tube is still intact. In grade 3, the endoneurium is also lost, but the perineurium is intact. In grade 4, the perineurium is lost, but the epineurium is intact. In grade 5, the epineurium is also lost. So we can see on the right hand side corner that the recovery potential is good when it's about grade 1 or grade 2, whereas when it goes beyond it, it's still very inconsistent. The recovery may be happening or it may not happen at all. Now we can see in this picture here that something written as grade 6. Now, this is a very true clinical scenario because a nerve which undergoes some pressure or some type of injury will not have a uniform pattern of injury throughout the cross section. Some part of the nerve may have a grade 5 damage, whereas some part of the nerve may have a grade 2 damage. So there are certain authors who describe, and there is a combination of these grades. They call it as grade 6 because again here the recovery is not predictable. Am I clear in this slide? Any doubts here? Because this is very important when we go on to the specific nerve injuries. If there is any doubt, please ask me. Okay, fine. I assume there is no. Yeah. Please come in. Thought somebody wanted to say something. Okay. So we'll move on. What happens after injury? Something called as the Wallerian degeneration happens. From the point of injury, distal to it, the axon as well as the myelin sheath disintegrates. And this disintegration also proceeds in a proximal direction, but only till the immediately superior node of Ranvier. From that point, sprouting axon tips grow towards the target compartment, and one tendril may reach the intact endoneurial tube and proceeds to grow down the endoneurial tube to reach its target organ. The rate of growth is about 1 mm per day. The important catch here is we can wait for a period of about a maximum of 2 years, because if the nerve doesn't reach its target organ by a time period of 2 years, the target organ becomes totally functional. It loses its function totally. Otherwise, it won't be able to recover its normal function at all. So that is the maximum time that can happen. Now, why there is a limit of 2 years? Now, if you assume there is a nerve root avulsion of about say an L5 nerve root avulsion, you all must be aware that it supplies till the grade 2. Now, if you take a measurement of the nerve from the L5 nerve root near the spine to the grade 2, it must be anywhere by about say 100 centimeters or so, minimum of 1 meter. Now, 1 mm per day will actually equate to about 1000 days, if I'm right. It's actually more than 2 years. If it takes that much of time for the nerve to reach its target organ, by that time the muscle would have completely degenerated. So this is why we say we can wait for about a maximum of 2 years. Am I clear in this? Any doubts here? Am I clear in this point? Because this is very important when you go to the exam and you give what will be your management plan. So what are the clinical features? Symptoms. The patient may come with any of these symptoms. They may complain of numbness, loss of sensation, weakness in the limb, and abnormal gait. For example, a patient with sciatic nerve palsy, he may complain of a foot drop, right, or a slapping pain. The signs which we make up from the patient. The patient will have altered skin features. There will be loss of sweat. The skin may appear about, say, stretched, shiny and all. There will be obvious muscle wasting. If there is an axillary nerve paralysis, which you might have seen in the shoulder dislocation cases, there will be obvious deltoid wasting. There will also be abnormal posture and loss of sensation, which will be very evident. If suppose the patient has got loss of sensation in his hands, there may be burns in his hand because they won't recognize the temperature, heat and all. They will have cigarette burns, or even a hot teacup can also cause burns. And people with sciatic nerve palsy can have ulcers in the foot because they don't recognize the pain there. And loss of muscle power as well. So what are all the tests we need to do? These are the tests which are actually advised. We need to elicit touch, pain, temperature, position, vibration, pressure sense, 2-point discrimination, threshold, locognosia. Locognosia is otherwise localizing the touch. But we not do all these tests in the exam. In the exam, touch and pain are most important. If possible, you can do temperature. And vibration sense, you can always use a tuning fork to tell whether it's intact or not. Proprioception is nothing but your position. Now, with regards to muscle power, hope you all know what is given here. This is the MRC grading of muscle power. Can anyone tell me how to go about palpating or how to go about checking this muscle power? There is a specific method to it, which is actually checked during your clinical examination. Any volunteers? So, for example, you can take the biceps muscle. Just tell me how will you check the biceps muscle?
We're checking the tone of muscle while contracting.
No, I'm asking, the examiner is asking you, doctor, please check the biceps and tell me the muscle power which the individual has. How will you go about it?
Against resistance.
Okay. Okay, please go ahead. Because this is very important. The examiner even forgive you if you are wrong about the diagnosis. But if the examiner finds out that the muscle power which you have noted in the case sheet is wrong, then you won't be forgiven. So this is very important. Okay, fine. I'll tell it myself. See, if we take biceps as the example, whenever you ask the individual, whenever you examine a patient, you always check on the normal side first. Okay, that is very important. The examiner will be watching you keenly whether you go to the abnormal side first or the normal side first. So whenever you are asked to demonstrate the muscle power, always check the normal side first. Now, when you ask the patient to flex the elbow for biceps, actually your hand should be on the muscle to feel the muscle contraction, because there may not be a movement. Are you able to understand that? The patient will try to move his hand, but there won't be movement at the elbow. But obviously the muscle will twitch, which you can feel with your hand like this. So that is grade 1. Am I clear here?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So always feel the muscle which you are going to test. Feel it with your hand and then ask them to move. So if there is a visible or a palpable contraction, then it is grade 1. If there is no finding at all, then it is grade 0. Okay, now we will come to grade 2. What is grade 2 actually? Anybody? What is grade 2? So you need to understand this. This is very, very important.
There is contraction, but there is no movement. The person,
Yeah. No, actually, there will be some movement. You can read it from here. It says the movement is possible only with gravity is eliminated, right? Now, for this example, I think you can take the IP joint. Can you see my picture here in the screen? I'll consider this proximal IP joint and I'll show you, I'll demonstrate you this. Now, this is flexion, this is extension for this joint. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, fine. So now the position is this, and I'm asking the patient to do IP joint extension. Now this is movement against gravity. Do you all agree? Right? This is the starting position.
Yes, sir.
And the patient is doing this. This is against gravity. Now how will you check this with gravity eliminated? Very simple. You just need to tilt the joint 90 degrees. Tilt it this way. See, now ask the patient to straighten it. Am I clear?
Yes,
See,
sir.
now the gravity is not helping the patient, right? This is against gravity. If I ask them to flex it, the gravity will help them. But in this position, there is no effect of gravity because the movement is occurring in a plane which is very parallel to the floor. So there is no action of gravity. Am I clear? The same thing happens for the
Yes, sir.
elbow as well. The same thing happens for the elbow as well. If you need to check for triceps power, triceps is, what is the action of triceps?
Extension of L.
Extension of elbow, right? Now, if suppose the patient has got some muscle power, how will you check it against gravity? How will you check elbow against gravity? Because if you make the patient stand like this, if the starting position is this, gravity will definitely help them to do elbow extension. So that won't be the true power in that particular patient. So how will you check elbow power? So you need to abduct the arm here and leave it, dangle the elbow like this. Now, if the patient is able to lift against gravity, then there is a minimum of power 3. Am I clear? Am I clear here? You keep the position like this, and you ask the patient to straighten his elbow. If he is able to do, the power is minimum 3. But if he is not able to do, now you bring it in this way. bring it parallel to the floor and ask him to straighten it. If he does this, now the power is, what is the power now?
2.
2. Very good. Now the power is 2. Right? But if I feel the triceps and I ask him to straighten it, there is no movement, but there is a visible contraction here. Now the power is
1.
1. Very good. If there is no contraction at all, if there is no visible or palpable contraction here, then the power is
0.
0. Very good. Hope you got it right. So you keep in this position, you feel the muscle and ask them to straighten the elbow. If there is nothing, it is grade 0. If there is some contraction but no movement, it is grade 1. If there is some movement but only in this plane, it is grade 2. If he is able to lift it against gravity, it is grade 3. Now, what is the difference between grade 4 and 5? This is why the examiner expects you to check the opposite limb first. Now you check, consider my right hand is affected and my left hand is normal. Left hand is in this position and the examiner is checking the elbow extension by giving resistance. I am not able to do it with full resistance, but when the resistance is reduced, I'll be able to do it. Right? But sorry, don't get confused. This is the normal, right? You know the amount of resistance by which the patient is able to do it. Now you give the same resistance in the abnormal. Right? If he is not able to do it with the full resistance, but when the resistance is reduced, he is able to move it. It shows that the patient has got some power, but not equal to the opposite side. So this is grade 4. When both limbs are normal and when they're able to do equal resistance on both sides, that is grade 5. Are you clear in this? Am I clear in this? Are you getting the message clear?
Yes,
What is
sir.
the difference between 4 and 5? We take the opposite side. When there is equal power as the opposite side, then it is grade 5. When it is unequal or the normal limb has got a power which is more superior to the affected limb, then it is grade 4. This is how exactly we should measure the muscle power which is present in that particular individual and that particular limb. Am I clear? This is very, very important because this is what you are going to write in the case sheet. Okay? Any doubts in this muscle grading? Let us get clarified it here itself. Any of the participants, if you have any doubt, just let me know. Or just one, can you repeat just what's shown in the slide? Can you start from grade 0? What is it? Any one of you?
Grade 0 visible with palpable contraction, no visible or palpable contraction. Grade 1 is visible or palpable contraction but no movement. Grade 2 is movement is possible only when gravity is eliminated. Grade 3 is movement is possible against gravity but not against resistance. Grade 4, movement is possible against some resistance but not when there is an opposing power, not more than the other side.
Yeah.
Grade 5, full muscle power.
Now, why did I say to compare with the opposite side? Now assume the patient is very thin. The person examining the patient is a bodybuilder, right? There will be obvious difference between the power in these two muscles, right? Now, if the bodybuilder gives very good resistance and there is no movement on both sides, then can we say that this patient doesn't have normal power? Are you getting the point? That is not right. That is why we should check the normal side. Because we have a side to compare, which is the opposite normal side. Now, first you assume what is the amount of power available in that particular limb or in that particular normal limb, and then using that knowledge, you assess the affected side. Are you getting the message here? Because if the patient is very thin and the examiner is very strongly built, definitely there won't be any movement at all. Then we can say that there is no movement, the power is 0. Are you getting the point?
Yes,
Am I
sir.
clear here? Okay, fine. So we'll move ahead. And this is very important. What's Tinel sign? Now, Tinel sign is something where whenever a nerve is injured, we should all know the surface anatomy of the nerves. You must have read it earlier. So here, I think they are checking the, what nerve is being checked here? Can anybody tell me? Sorry?
Ulnar nerve.
Very good. They are checking the ulnar nerve. Suppose this is the cubital tunnel, right? The nerve passes through the tunnel or tunnel formed by a fibrous sheet beneath the medial epicondyle. Okay. Now, whenever a nerve is injured anywhere from its origin from the axilla or anywhere close to its end or limb, whenever it is stroked at that particular point of injury, the patient will have a sensation of dysesthesia. Otherwise, they will complain of some pins and needles. What does this literally mean? If suppose the injury is actually happening here, and with recovery, like what we discussed in the Valerian degeneration, some sprouting nerve fibers will start to grow from the proximal. Are you able to follow me? So following an injury, during recovery, some sprouting axons will start to grow from the proximal end, and these fibers will be initially unmyelinated. Otherwise, they will be very sensitive to touch. Now, when these fibers are stimulated, the brain will recognize as if something is happening in this region. Actually, we are not touching here. We are actually touching here. But there is a cortical representation of all our body organs. Hope you remember that. And little finger has got a representation in the brain. The ring finger has got a separate representation in the brain. So whichever nerve fiber is being stimulated, our brain will assume that something is happening in that particular area. Now, when this Tinel sign is actually progressing, otherwise when it is growing, we can assume that the nerve is found to recover and the axon is growing from the proximal to distal direction. So, as I said earlier, this is stimulation of naked axons. And this is very important point. This is absent in neuropraxia, because in neuropraxia, it is only conduction block. There is no regrowth of the nerve. Hope you remember what is neuropraxia. We were discussing the Seddon's and Sunderland's classification. It is only conduction block and there is no damage to the axon. So there is no possibility of a naked axon growing from the proximal to the distal direction. So this particular thing is absent in neuropraxia. So whenever you have a patient with peripheral nerve palsy and you perform the Tinel sign, the Tinel sign is positive, it indicates that the severity of injury is more than neuropraxia. Are you clear? Are you able to follow me? So when the Tinel sign is positive, the severity of nerve injury is more than neuropraxia. Whenever there is a static Tinel sign, you check the patient now, you check them after 2 weeks. If, as we discussed earlier, the nerve should grow at a rate of about 1 mm per day. So it is about 14 millimeters. If you check the patient about 2 weeks after this date, this Tinel sign should have progressed from here to here. So that is why we should always tap from distal to proximal, not from proximal to distal. Because only when you tap from distal to proximal, you will be actually stimulating the unmyelinated growing naked axons. Okay. So when this Tinel sign has progressed from this point to here, you can be sure that the nerve is recovering. But if it is static, it is not all growing, then it again indicates the severity of injury is more and the recovery is very less. Okay. Advancing Tinel sign is good. Now, these two things are the investigations in peripheral nerve injury. I don't want to go into the depth of it because this itself is actually a separate topic. I will just describe in brief what is exactly being done here. Electromyography is nothing but here they use a concentric needle which actually has got a stimulating electrode and a recording electrode. It is inserted into the desired muscle and the stimulating electrode gives a pulse and the muscle reacts to it, and this reaction is received by the recording electrode and passed on to the amplifier, which amplifies the signal and which is further passed on to oscilloscope, which gives a tracing like this. And this is also supplied to a loudspeaker where we will be able to hear the muscle contraction. Now, why this is being done? Whenever there is distribution of supply to a muscle, and say for about a period of 3 weeks has elapsed since the injury, the muscle has not got any nerve supply from the parent nerve. It shows potential called denervation potential. So whenever you see a denervation potential, that shows complete loss of nerve supply. This doesn't happen in neuropraxia because neuropraxia recovers and the conduction is re-established. So EMG is done to determine whether there is a complete or incomplete block of conduction or incomplete damage to the nerve. Now, what is done in nerve conduction study? As we said earlier, we should know the surface anatomy of the nerves. here they use two electrodes. One is like here, it stimulates or it sends an impulse. This impulse travels along the nerve, and this is again recorded from a recording electrode. Now, the time taken for the impulse from here to reach here, which is called the latency, and the intensity signal strength, gives an idea about how much damage the nerve has got initially suffered. Otherwise, you can also assess where the exact location of injury has happened to this particular nerve. This is what I've said right now is very, very simple and basic of EMG and nerve conduction study. For your level, I think this will do. Okay, if you are interested, you can go back and refer. There are very few journals and textbooks which describe this procedure in detail. So, what are the principles of management? Most commonly, the management is conservative, and the indications are neuropraxia or a low energy injury, or if the nerve is a pure motor or pure sensory nerve. Because here, the conditions which are needed to get re-established are relatively easy when compared to a mixed nerve. So these are the situations where we can try conservative management. And what we aim here, we aim to maintain the joints support. Suppose if there is a wrist drop, if we leave the patient in this position, the plexus will undergo contraction. The patient won't be able to take back the wrist to a neutral position. So we need to maintain a supple joint. We need to prevent contractures and as well protect the skin. And next option is surgical management. I will just brush through these slides because these are not much important in your exams. So these are planned when the nerve is going to be divided on presentation, or a clinical suggestion, a clinical presentation suggests division, and or there is an expected delayed recovery. Like we said, if the distance needed to travel by the nerve is far beyond the 2-year critical time period, then we should do something. We should go back. We should go and intervene surgically. And if there is a very delayed recovery, to conservative management. For example, we tried conservative management in a patient, we waited for some time, but there is no progress or no response, then we can go for surgical management. What are the options? Primary repair of the damaged nerve or delayed repair. Okay. And I think I'll just skip this slide. This is actually a technique of nerve repair, which you can go back and read. And in order to bridge a gap, these are all the possible options we have. We can either splint the joint or mobilizing the nerve. The most common mobilizing nerve scenario is the ulnar nerve, where the nerve is transposed from the posterior aspect to the anterior aspect of the medial epicondyle nerve. All other options are just theory. What is the sign of recovery? Whenever the patient says there is some return of sensation, it is a definite sign of recovery. And there is motor march. Suppose if the nerve is injured at the level of the spiral groove, and the muscle which is immediately distal to the nerve gets a supply after say a few days, then we can be sure that the nerve is recovering or the nerve damage is repairing by itself. This is called as motor march. It recovers from proximal to distal. So this we complete the introduction to nerve injuries. Any doubts till now? After this, we will jump into radial nerve proper. Any doubts? Was I not clear in any point which I conveyed? Fine, I assume I was clear. Okay. So we'll go into specific nerve injuries. The first today we will see radial nerve alone. We will see the other nerves in the subsequent class. So when you get a case of radial nerve exam, radial nerve palsy in the exam, what is expected from the candidate? The candidate should know the radial nerve anatomy properly. Because if the candidate even has an improper diagnosis or doesn't convey the management plan appropriately, the examiner will forgive you if you just give the radial nerve anatomy in very accurate manner. So this is most important thing. The next important thing is identifying the level of lesion, whether it is low palsy or a high palsy or a very high palsy. And assess the severity of injury. You will be able to differentiate whether it was a neuropraxia or something beyond neuropraxia. Because only that can be done clinically. All other things you will need to do some examinations. And what is the ideal plan of management for that particular patient? So if you are able to arrive at this, that completes radial nerve case in your final year examination. So what is the anatomy of the nerve? You all know that radial nerve is also called as the musculospiral nerve because it's majority a motor nerve. And it travels along the spiral groove of the shaft of humerus. Now, this is actually a continuation of the posterior cord of the brachial plexus, receiving supply from all the nerve roots of brachial plexus, starting from C5 to D1. and it is the largest branch of brachial plexus. Now, if you just recollect the anatomy, initially it starts in the axilla as continuation of the posterior cord. It just travels behind the brachial artery, and just above the spiral groove, it supplies all three heads of the triceps muscle and gives rise to the posterior brachiocutaneous nerve, and passes through the spiral canal accompanied by the profunda brachii artery, and from there it comes out and pierces the lateral intermuscular septum to enter into the anterior compartment. Here it supplies brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, unconeus, and gives off another sensory branch, which is the dorsal antebrachiocutaneous nerve, and it divides into two: the superficial radial nerve and the deep radial nerve. Superficial radial nerve travels across the front of forearm and covers the brachioradialis, and it is pure sensory nerve. It supplies the thumb, index, and middle finger. There are some confusions regarding the sensory supply of nerve, of this radial nerve, because anatomy textbook give a different perspective depending on the actions. Most common thing is it supplies the dorsum of thumb, index, and middle fingers. A few textbooks says it also supplies the radial side of little finger. So don't get confused about it. And the specific area is the first dorsal web space. You will see it in detail shortly. And what about the deep radial nerve or the posterior interosseous nerve? It supplies all extrinsic wrist and finger extensors, all the muscles on the posterior aspect of the forearm. Now, I've just covered it in a very brief manner. If suppose the examiner wants further more detail, it's better you go back and read your anatomy textbook. Now, what is low radial nerve palsy? Low radial nerve palsy is something when the lesion happens here. Otherwise, the posterior interosseous nerve alone is damaged. Now, radial nerve palsy can be recognized by drops. There are few drops. One is the thumb drop, another is the finger drop, a wrist drop, and elbow drop. You remember all these drops, and if you are able to identify which drop is present and which drop is absent, then you will be able to arrive at the diagnosis. So, with regards to low radial nerve palsy, there is damage to the posterior interosseous nerve alone. As we saw just now, it is a pure motor nerve. Therefore, there is no sensation loss in this particular level of radial nerve palsy. Or low radial nerve palsy, there is no sensory disturbance at all. What are the drops present here? The drop here is loss of MCP extension, which we call it as the finger drop. Loss of extension and retroposition of the thumb, which we call as the thumb drop. As I said earlier, there is no sensory loss. So what about the weakness in the extension of wrist? Now, there is a difference between drop and weakness. When you compare the normal side, if the patient is able to do equal dorsiflexion of the wrist on both sides, like this, then the power is equal on both sides. If it is totally hanging like this, it is wrist drop. But in some patients, you will notice that the patient will be able to bring it to some extent, but not as good as the opposite side. That shows there is weakness in extension of the wrist. We will see the reason why. These are the two confusing facts here. You just see the lower point right now, because the wrist extension is done by ECRL and ECRP. Otherwise, extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis. Now, if you have a look at this anatomy picture here, extensor carpi radialis longus is supplied even before the origin of the posterior interosseous nerve. Therefore, in low radial nerve palsy, this muscle is spared. The ECRL will act, but ECRB is lost because it is supplied by the posterior interosseous nerve. Therefore, the patient will not have as good power as the normal side, but still there won't be wrist drop as well. When you ask the patient to lift his wrist, he will be able to do it, but not as good as the opposite side. So this is weakness in extension of wrist, but not wrist drop. Now, the other confusing point here is thumb abduction. Hope you all know what is abduction in the thumb. Actually, if you see my hand here, or I'll keep it this way, abduction is possible in two planes. This is also abduction, whereas this is also abduction. Now, this is radial abduction, and this is palmar abduction. Now, this abduction is actually done by the nerve supplied here. The muscle abductor pollicis brevis, which is actually supplied by the median nerve. So you should not get confused. The radial abduction is lost, whereas this abduction, the palmar abduction, may be present. If you remember, there is one particular test to see whether this muscle is functioning. Can anybody tell me what is the name of the test? It comes in median nerve actually. Anybody? Okay, fine. We'll see it in median nerve. No worries.
Hard test.
Sorry?
Pen test.
Hard.
Very good. It's not a test, it is pen test, right? So we usually check this. This is also abduction, but it is palmar abduction of the thumb, which will be still present in a patient with radial nerve palsy. But radial abduction is lost. And this is opposition, this is retroposition. This is also lost here. Okay. So are you able to know the difference between wrist drop and weakness in wrist extension? Because this is where the candidate gets confused. Okay. Now, which are all scenario you can have low radial nerve palsy? See, injury as noted in this picture is very close to the elbow. Dislocation of the elbow, radial head fractures, radial neck fractures, during fixation of proximal radius fractures using plate. This can also be an iatrogenic injury. The posterior interosseous nerve can be damaged. So these are all the scenarios where you can get low radial nerve palsy, right? Hope the message is clear there. We will go to the next level. What is high radial nerve palsy? High radial nerve palsy, lesion happens at the level of spiral groove. Now here, what are all the features which were present in the previous section are also present here. In addition to it, there are some other features. Remember it that way. So initially there was thumb drop, finger drop, but there was weakness of extension. But here there will be total wrist drop, because both ECRL as well as ECRB is lost here, right? Am I clear now? There is thumb drop, finger drop and wrist drop. In addition to the previous finding, you will have a sensory loss here, because the first dorsal intermetacarpal space, this area is very specific for radial nerve, and that is lost because superficial radial nerve is also lost. So this is called wrist drop. You see the opposite side. The patient is able to do wrist extension, but here there is a drop, very clear and total. Suppose the patient is able to raise it to some extent, but not as good as the opposite side, then we call it as weakness in extension. Okay, is that concept clear?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, good. Okay. So some textbooks say radial nerve supplies only till the middle finger. Some textbooks says it also supplies the radial side of ring finger. You need not get confused with it. But the specific area is this triangle alone. The first dorsal metacarpal space. This is very specific. This the sensation in this area is lost. Then it is high radial nerve palsy. Right? Now what happens in very high radial nerve palsy? So the features which are present in low radial nerve palsy will be there. In addition to it, you will also have elbow drop. So there will be thumb drop, finger drop, wrist drop. In addition to it, there will be elbow drop. The patient will not be able to raise his elbow, and the lesion will be at the level of axilla, right? And here the sensory loss is the entire radial nerve distribution territory. Otherwise, as shown in this picture, this is the posterior cutaneous nerve of arm, posterior cutaneous nerve of forearm, and the superficial radial nerve. The sensation in all these areas are lost when the lesion is a very high radial nerve palsy. Now, to bring all this in a singular tabular column, so these are the levels of palsy and these are the drops and sensory loss. So when it comes to low radial nerve palsy, there is finger drop, thumb drop. There is no wrist drop, but the extension is weak. There is no elbow drop and no sensory loss. When it comes to high radial nerve palsy, there is finger drop, there is thumb drop, wrist drop, but elbow drop is not present. And the sensory loss is limited to first dorsal leg space alone. When it is very high radial nerve palsy, all drops are present. Finger drop, thumb drop, wrist drop, elbow drop, and the sensation of the entire radial nerve is lost. So if you remember this one tabular column, you will be able to exactly locate where the nerve damage has happened in that particular patient. Now both pictures are actually Saturday night palsy. And if you look at the first picture, where you assume the damage will be? Whether it will be a low palsy, high palsy, or a very high palsy?
Very high palsy.
Very good. This will be a very high palsy because even here, though it is, this is also called Saturday night palsy, the pressure actually happens here. So it will be a very high radial nerve palsy. Can you tell me what all the drops will be present in this particular patient?
Finger drop, thumb
Elbow.
drop,
Yes,
Elbow
elbow
drop.
drop, wrist drop. All the drops will be.
very good. This patient will have all drops in addition to what about the sensation?
All radial nerve areas.
Very good, very good. So the entire radial nerve area will be lost. Now coming to this picture, you can see that the arm is hanging outside and there is compression at the edge of the sofa. So what do you think the level of compression will be?
High
be a-
radial nerve palsy.
Yes, exactly. The compression will be at the level of spiral groove and this will be a high radial nerve palsy. So which movement will be spared here?
Elbow drop.
Very good. So elbow drop will be absent. All other drops will be present, but elbow drop will not be present. And what about the sensation?
Dorsal in first dorsal.
First
Very good.
dorsal
Very
metacarpal.
good, very good, very good. So only the first dorsal web space will be lost. The remaining areas will be. Now this is something called as the honeymoon palsy, where the partner sleeps on the patient's arm. This is also mostly a high radial nerve palsy, and it can happen in the picture shown either the first or the second. And there is something called Wartenberg syndrome. If suppose you are very good in your exam and you have answered all the questions, the examiner will still want you to ask a question where you will suffer. So this is one favorite question by the examiner. What is Wartenberg syndrome? This is nothing but it is an isolated palsy of the superficial radial nerve. If you remember the anatomy picture, all we discussed was the motor component of the nerve. Whereas when it is an isolated palsy of the superficial radial nerve, there won't be any drops at all. All movements will be present, but only the first dorsal web space will be lost. And rather than loss of sensation, the patient will be complaining of pins and needles in this particular area. Because it is a sensory nerve, it will be more of a paresthesia type of complaint from the patient. And if you have a look at this picture, you can see that the superficial, this is the brachioradialis muscle. And the nerve passes very close to it. It can be compressed anywhere, but most commonly in the middle level, leading to compressive neuropathy of superficial radial nerve. There is another name to it. Anybody know what it is? There is some term called neuralgia paresthetica, which happens in the iliac crest level. Very similar name to it. Sorry? Can you come again?
Wallenberg.
Wallenberg. No, that is something different. A name which rhymes with neuralgia. We call it as chiralgia paresthetica. Okay. Neuralgia paresthetica is the nerve which crosses the iliac crest level. Here we call it as the chiralgia paresthetica. Don't worry, this won't be asked in your exams until your what is answered all questions of the exam. So in this one slide, we'll be discussing what is the management. The slide, sorry for this busy slide, actually I've tried to incorporate all concepts in one particular slide. So if there is radial nerve palsy and if you see an open injury, there is no need to wait, you go for immediate repair. And if it is a closed injury, which is on presentation, you just sprint and wait for 12 weeks time. And I think beyond this, you have to go back and read it, because if we discuss one particular slide, it will take more than 10 minutes, or if there is time left at the end, I'll come back to this slide again. Okay. So suppose we are, as said here, this is the most important, sprint and wait for 12 weeks. Because if patient comes to you with a Saturday night palsy with a compression at the level of the spiral groove, this is your diagnosis in the exam. And now you check for Tinel sign. Tinel sign is absent. So what is the severity of injury now? Tinel sign is absent. It is neuropraxia. Hope you recollect what is said earlier. Tinel sign is present only in injury which is severe than neuropraxia, right? This is just a mechanical compression. And once the compression is relieved, there is some amount of conduction block leading to wrist drop, thumb drop, etc. So this is most commonly a
First degree.
neuropraxia. Yeah, neuropraxia. But the same cannot be said if suppose the patient had a humerus shaft fracture. There is something called Halston-Lewis fracture, where the fracture happens at the level of middle third and distal third junction of the humerus. There exactly, if you recollect the anatomy, the nerve pierces the lateral intermuscular septum and comes anteriorly. The sharp spike of the fracture may actually lacerate the nerve. This can happen either during the injury or during manipulation after the fracture has happened. Here, the lesion will not be neuropraxia. Are you able to get the message what I'm trying to convey? Okay. If it is only Saturday night palsy, it will be mostly neuropraxia. Whereas if it is following a shaft humerus fracture, it can be severe than neuropraxia. The tinal sign will be absent if it is neuropraxia. The tinal sign will be present if it is anything beyond neuropraxia. Okay. Are you getting the message? So in a
Yes,
case,
sir.
yeah, in exam, most commonly you will be given a patient with neuropraxia. In that scenario, our treatment is wait and watch. Wait and watch, but at the same time, you should not the limb to go into contractions. See, as we all discussed earlier, whenever there is wrist drop, thumb drop, and finger drop, this is the position the patient will keep his hand. Now, if you keep your hand this way, you won't be able to make a grip at all. You can also try doing it now. Keep your hand in this position and try to hold something. You won't be able to do because the flexors which are in the anterior aspect of forearm need a proper pre-tensioning to make a proper grip. Now, if you need to add some spice to it, you would have seen this in action films. Whenever there is a fight between the hero and villain, the villain may try to assault the hero with a knife. What will the hero do? He will grasp here and do this maneuver, and the knife will drop. Hope you all have seen this image, seen this picture in movies. The reason here is once the hero does this, actually there is the power of flexion is lost. See, you can even try this right now. Keep your wrist in this position and try to make the fist. You won't be able to do it because the flexors won't have adequate power. So we need wrist dorsiflexion for the flexors to act and to make a fist. Right? I think somebody is trying it right now. J is doing it. Not a problem. You can do it. Okay. So that is the reason we need to give the splint. If you leave the patient as such, the nerve may take more time to recover. And if you leave it in this position, the flexors will go in for contraction. So the nerve may actually recover, but the patient will not be able to have a free range of wrist dorsiflexion. So this is where you apply these type of splint. The picture shown here is a static splint. This does not offer any movement at all. It just maintains the wrist in extension and CT in extension. The ideal position is this position. Extension at the level of wrist and flexion at the level of MCP. This is the functional position of the hand. Now, these splint are actually an added advantage to the splint shown below. These are called dynamic cocker splint because they will have some rubber band or elastic springs attached, and they will still maintain the patient's hand in this position. And maintaining this position, the patient will be able to do exercises for flexors, so that by the time they wait for nerve recovery, they don't lose their flexor strength as well. Right? Are you able to understand what I'm trying to say? The wrist will be maintained in the functional position, as well as they will be able to do some wrist exercise to the flexors. So this is the most common management which you will be telling in your exams. And the salvage method. I think now we have some time. Can I take some 5 minutes to discuss this slide alone? Right? Hope I'm not boring you much. So you apply the splint and wait for 12 weeks. If there is recovery, you wait for complete recovery. And when it is full recovery, well and good, the patient is happy, you are happy. But suppose the recovery is incomplete, what will you do? Now, when the injury severity is more, there is a lacerated nerve on presentation. You do nerve exploration. If it is damaged, you go for repair. It can be a gap repair or a non-gap repair, and you wait for recovery. Now you have tried all these methods, and ultimately there is incomplete recovery. What is the salvage now? The salvage option is discussed in this slide. Because the nerve will not recur, the muscle won't recover. Now you will have to do some tendon transfers. Something called as where you can sacrifice one muscle and contribute its function to another muscle. Here, the desired action is wrist extension. As I said earlier, only if there is wrist extension, the other flexors can act. So pronator teres is something which can be sacrificed because pronation can be done by other muscles as well. So we sacrifice the pronator, we detach it from its origin, from its insertion into the radius, and attach it to the tendon of extensor carpi radialis brevis. So this will give you wrist extension. Now the next action we require is the MCP extension as well. This is the finger drop, right? So we need to correct the finger drop. Flexor carpi radialis, we sacrifice that. You detach its insertion and attach it to extensor digitorum here, right? And thumb abduction, right? Because if you need to grasp something, the fingers need to open up and then only you can grab it. If all these fingers are in this position, you won't be able to grab it. So we need thumb extension and retro position. So we can sacrifice the palmaris longus and attach it to abductor pollicis longus, right? Actually, there are many lot of tendon transfers, but these are the most basic tendon transfers. And if you're able to give this answer to the examiner, definitely you're going to get full marks. To be clear here, one muscle for one particular action. One muscle is lost, we are compensating it by the other muscle which can be sacrificed. Okay, clear now? Time for doubts. I think I've completed my talk in 1 hour. Any doubts? Anybody? Was he not clear in any point? Or do I need to repeat something?
So,
Yeah.
so in that lower radial of palsy, you had said that which one will be spared, sir? The ECRL will be spared or the ECRB will be spared?
ECRL will be spared because extensor carpi radialis longus is supplied by the proper radial nerve. Extensor carpi radialis brevis is supplied by the posterior interosseous nerve, which arises after the bifurcation of the proper radial nerve. So ECRL is spared, but ECRB is lost. Clear in that? Because only if these two muscles act together, you will get maximum wrist extension. Otherwise, you are going to have weakness in wrist extension. There won't be wrist drop. You won't have wrist drop, but the patient will be able to do wrist extension, but not to the level which is possible on the opposite side, because one muscle is missed. Clear now?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Welcome. Any other doubts? Because this is the place you should get clarified all your doubts. You can make mistakes here. The doubts can be silly, no problem, not a problem. But you need to be very clear when you go to the exam. Yeah.
Regarding the power of the muscle, sir, the power, the dominant hand அதிகமா இருக்காதா sir?
Possible, you're right. But technically what you say is very correct. If the person is a right-handed dominant person, muscle power will be very good on his normal side. But you will be definitely able to appreciate the difference if the power is reduced on the abnormal side. See, if you check, you can as well check in your, can I suggest you a method? You just catch hold of few of your friends and check it yourself today evening. Check the power in the right biceps and left biceps. There will be some amount of difference. But in case of a nerve palsy, the amount of difference you will be able to appreciate is definitely very good. You won't get confused in that area. Am I right? Are you able to getting what I'm trying to say?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
There will be some amount of power difference in a normal individual between his dominant and a non-dominant. But if the same individual has got a palsy, the difference in power will be very obvious. It won't be very confusing at all. So you need not worry about it.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, welcome. Any other doubts? Yeah.
So by Tinel sign, we can say that if it is neuroparaxia or more severe, how to differentiate axonot muscles and neuronot muscles?
Yeah, very technical question. Actually, that can be done only by doing for like I said, your EMG and your nerve conduction study, you need all those investigations. Clinically, you can't differentiate it. Clinically, you can't differentiate any injury other than neuropraxia. All other severity of grading, you will definitely need some other investigations. Clinically, it is not possible. You will need to do further investigations to check and to clearly say that is the type of damage. Like I said earlier, the type 6, hope you remember, it's not very uniform pattern everywhere. In some part of the nerve may have a type 4 injury. Some part of the nerve may have a type 3 injury. All we are bothered about is not the type of injury. All we are bothered about is the recovery potential that the particular individual has. So if it is neuropraxia, the potential is very good. We are also happy. But if it is anything beyond that, the recovery potential is not predictable. So we try to plan our management based on what is the best possible for that particular individual. You need not worry about the severity alone. See, when the Tinel sign is present, the question in the exam will be Tinel sign present or absent. So if it is absent and there is a palsy, it is neuropraxia. Are you clear in that? See, there is some palsy, there is some drop, finger drop, thumb drop, and there is no Tinel sign, then it is neuropraxia. But if there is thumb drop, finger drop, and the Tinel sign is positive, like I said earlier, it may be a laceration at the level of shaft or at the level of spiral groove. So this is not neuropraxia, something beyond neuropraxia, but you won't be able to tell whether it's type 3 or type 4. That's not possible clinically. That needs further investigations. Am I clear? I answered your doubt?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
And to clearly say type 3 or type 5 or grade 3 or grade 5 is not important in your answer. You just need to give a plan of management. That's enough. Because it is neuropraxia, his nerve recovery is going to be very good. You can confidently tell, I will just splint this patient. I won't plan for surgical intervention at all. But if there is Tinel sign that indicates the nerve may be lacerated. In that scenario, you can give an option of surgical management. Right? Because all the points we are trying to discuss here is to arrive at a proper plan of management. If it is neuropraxia, definitely wait and watch. If it is anything beyond neuropraxia, then you divide or then you decide based on that particular patient and on the level of injury as well as the demand of that particular patient. It's not important to differentiate between type 3 and type 5 clinically. You just need to say if it's neuropraxia or something beyond it. That's it. That will do in the exams.
So in diagnosis, we don't want to mention about the severity then.
Not needed, not needed. You can see if the Tinel sign is present, you can say the injury severity is beyond neuropraxia. That will do. It can be anywhere from axonotmesis to neurotmesis. You can't say it clinically. If the Tinel sign is absent, then you can confidently say, sir, it is only a neuropraxia. And the patient will recover. Am I clear to you?
Yes, sir.
Any other doubts? Now, can we have an exam scenario? See, because we don't have a patient with us to discuss, can any one of you take this as an exam case and discuss? Any volunteer? I have also given the questions which will be asked. The scenario here is a 36-year-old male. Yeah, sir. Yeah, please come again.
No, sir, you continue, sir.
Okay. So it's a 36-year-old male complaining of weakness in his right limb for 2 days. The patient has weakness for 2 days, is coming to you, and you ask for the history. He says the history very similar to the picture depicted there. He said he consumed alcohol and he slept in that particular position. The next day morning he woke up. He found that his limb has lost some power and that is some obvious numbness, pins and needles and so. So
very high nerve.
Sorry, come again.
Very high nerve palsy, sir.
Good. So your diagnosis here will be very high nerve palsy. I agree. Can you answer the question number 1? What drops you expect here?
Expected all, sir, all joint, elbow drop, wrist drop, finger drop, and the thumb drop.
Very good. So what will be sensation loss you expect here?
The loss of sensation, sir, in the sir, posterior cutaneous nerve.
Yeah, loss of sensation in all brachial nerve, distribution area. Yeah. No confusion in this. There is no segregation of the nerve distribution of the entire radial nerve is lost, right? So the diagnosis you have already said. This is a very high radial nerve palsy. And what will be the management in this particular patient?
Don't know.
Just think about it. No, we have been discussing it for the past 10-15 minutes.
We have to give the splint and maintain the position of wrist in maintain the wrist position in extended position. So then we have to wait for 12 weeks. So if it's improving, it's okay. If it's not, we have to intervene.
But will you allow the elbow to hang as well?
No, sir. No, sir. We have to keep that also in extended position, sir, so that the flexion. So the flexors would be good. It won't be wasted.
No. The thing is, you should not allow the arm to hang, right? You will support it with an arm sling.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, can we use an aeroplane splint in this position, sir? In this case?
Aeroplane splint will keep the limb in abduction. Okay. Why do we need abduction here?
That, to support all the joints here, we can give aeroplane splint, right, sir?
But keeping your limb like this and moving around, will it be comfortable for you? Try assume keeping your hand in this position and moving among patients in a crowd. I don't think that will be easier to move around. So what we usually give is, we usually give an arm sling to keep it in this position. Camera, yeah, this position. So you don't leave it to hang here, because if you allow it to hang, then you will have dependent edema. You give an arm sling to support in this and this position. The hand should be in this position, not dropping like this. It should be in this position. Are you able to see that?
Okay.
See, you can, the thing is, I am not saying that you should not give an aeroplane splint, but technically and feasibility, definitely. If you see aeroplane splint, the arm will be like this. Hope you have seen it. It will maintain the limb in abduction, right? In this position. And it won't be easy to move around. Imagine if the patient's door is very narrow. Having a hand like this, you won't be able to enter his own room, right? So usually we don't give it. It's not needed. And moreover, shoulder abduction is not lost here. Abduction is caused by deltoid, which is supplied by the axillary nerve. That is still intact. So the patient will be able to do abduction whenever he wants. It's just that he won't be able to do extension of the elbow.
Thank you, sir.
Any other doubts? So this is how you will be given a case in the exam. 99% it will be only a Saturday night palsy. Very rarely you may get a fracture patient with radial nerve injury. In that scenario, you can be assured that it won't be an acute injury as well. The injury would have occurred some 2 to 3 months prior to the date of examination. Only those cases will be kept in the exam, because in the exam they won't keep you acute fractures. So here you can check, as we discussed, you can check for the Tinel sign along the surface marker of the radial nerve. If the Tinel sign is absent, you can be sure that it is just neuropraxia. So your management plan will be, I'll just wait and watch. Suppose the patient has got non-union of the humerus, you can address it. In that scenario, maybe you can do a nerve exploration. But suppose at the time of presentation, the fracture is already united. The fracture shaft of humerus is united, but still there is some amount of palsy. And get the history correctly, the patient will be able to give you that. So that also gives a clue that it is neuropraxia. Again, in this scenario, your management plan will be wait and watch. Only if it is a very clear-cut history or a clinical finding or an what is the other clues which indicate that there may be a complete transaction of the nerve, only then in the exam you should enter surgical management. Or in scenario where there is, if the injury is beyond 2 years duration, if the patient may give a history that the injury happened or 5 வருஷம் முன்னாடி கையில் அடிபட்டது சார், அப்பலேருந்து இந்த கை வேலை செய்யல, and there is no movement at all, and you should very sure there should be some movement possible. And that movement possible is since passive movement, not active movement. Because if you are going to give the answer of tendon transfer, then the joint should be sound. That is one prerequisite for tendon transfer. Suppose if the patient has got a fixed contractures here, you definitely cannot say tendon transfer. Because even if you do tendon transfer, the stiffness will not allow this movement at all. Right? So I don't think you won't get such confusing cases in the exam, but for knowledge sake, I'm discussing this. If suppose the history is more than 5 years, and the patient has got the palsy, but still is able to move his joints, or he has been using the splint properly. In that scenario, you can give an answer of tendon transfer. Otherwise, don't attempt tendon transfer at all. You can just stick to pelvic tendons. Any other doubts?
The tendon sign வந்து அந்த site of injury கிட்ட தான் will it be possible, or will it be possible throughout the course of the nerve, sir, in case of nerve injury?
Tendon sign, you're asking about tendon sign, is it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. See, the tendon sign is not something which is going to be static. That's what I wanted to say. Now I'll go back to the page, sir, so that I can explain it to you here. So this is tendon sign, right? Now assume the patient has got a dislocation elbow, and that has caused injury to the ulnar nerve in this position. The dislocation has been managed, it has been reduced, and a few weeks after the injury, the patient is presenting to you with complaints of numbness and typical features of ulnar nerve palsy. Now what you do is, you know the surface marking of ulnar nerve, you start tapping from distal to proximal. Assume it is 2 weeks following injury, and in 2 weeks you expect the nerve recovery to be 1 mm per day or 14 mm, right? So if the level of initial injury was here, and the tendon sign you examine today is elicited by tapping here, right? And you again examine the patient after 2 weeks, should have progressed here. Are you able to see this red arrow?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So initially it was here. After 2 weeks, the tendon sign happens when you tap in this position. See, you should remember always you should tap from distal to proximal, not proximal to distal. Because only if you go from distal to proximal, you will be able to locate the unmyelinated axons very clearly. So on the date of injury, it was here. After some 2 weeks, it was say 14 mm lower than that. And after a few weeks, it is still progressed further downwards or further distally. That indicates that the nerve is undergoing a repair and the axons are growing from the proximal to the towards the target organ. Are you able to understand it clearly?
Yes, sir.
Right? Now, if suppose the tendon sign is not progressing, otherwise it is not advancing distally, that indicates the nerve injury or the grading of injury was severe. Like as I said, if it was in grade 3 or grade 4, the epineurium, the grade 5 epineurium is lost. Grade 4 perineurium is lost. Now we assume grade 4. What happens in grade 4? The endoneurium is lost, the perineurium is also lost, only the epineurium is intact. There will be regeneration, but you won't have the distal endoneurial tube for the axon to grow in. It will be almost a clumsy fibrous tissue along with nerve cells growing together, which we call it as the neuroma. In such a situation, the tendon sign will always be present only here. It won't advance distally. Right, it will be present only in that particular thing. That is a bad sign. Otherwise, what we say is there is no progress in the nerve injury. But assume if it is only grade 2, right? If it's an axonotmesis. If an axonotmesis, the endoneurial tube is still intact. The axon will continue to grow from the proximal to the distal direction. In that scenario, the tendon sign will start progressing distal. When you just need to mark the date and mark the site where the tendon sign was noted on that particular day of examination, and when the patient comes back to you, and you check it, if it has progressed still further distally, then you can definitely wait. This nerve recovery is going to be complete. Are you reading the message?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Any other doubts? How many participants are there? Close to 69 are there till on. Okay. Very good numbers. I'm very happy. I'll be happy to answer few more questions as well. I think there is one in the chat box. Somebody has
Sir, even a normal person get tingling sensation while tapping on ulnar nerve.
Sorry, come again.
Sir, if we tap on ulnar nerve, sir, on medial epicondyle, we also get the tingling sensation something.
Yeah, we get it, but that is not tendon sign. See, that is not tendon sign. It is you are actually stimulating the nerve which is close to the bone. That's why we call it as the funny bone, right? I'm not sure what to say. That phenomenon is actually you tap the nerve That is definitely not tinel sign. You are, because you are not stimulating the unmyelinated axons. You are actually tapping on the intact nerve that can give an electric shock-like sensation distal. Okay, that is not tinel sign. It's actually compression of the nerve or indirect stimulation of the nerve. That is definitely not the tinel sign.
Thank you, sir.
I think there is one doubt in the chat box, but tinel sign, can we say if it is neuropraxia or not? How to identify neurotmesis and axonotmesis? I think I've already answered that. Because tinel sign can only differentiate whether neuropraxia or whether the severity of injury is neuropraxia or beyond it. And you can use it to assess whether the regrowth is progressing or whether there is improvement. Only these 5 features can be got through tinel sign, nothing more than that. The next doubt is, can you please summarize the management part? Okay. We will go to the management slide. So, with regards to exam case, because we are more interested in exam case discussion, the typical scenario will be a neuropraxia or maybe a severe injury if there was a fracture shaft of humerus. Right? Now, always the initial plan will be splint and wait, except on presentation or on examination, if the X-ray shows that there is a very sharp spike of the fractured fragment which might have lacerated the nerve, only then you go for nerve exploration. Otherwise, in all cases, you just splint and wait for 12 weeks. You wait for recovery, and if it is recovering, by recovery I mean the motor march. The muscle which is immediately distal to the injury should have recurred by that time frame. For example, suppose if you assume the nerve injury is at the level of the spiral groove, immediately after coming out of the spiral groove, it supplies the brachioradialis, right? Brachioradialis, ECRL, it gives rise to the posterior cutaneous nerve of the forearm. Say after some 3 weeks means 21 days or 2.1 centimeter. Am I right? So 2.1 centimeter distal to the injury, all other muscles are still paralyzed, but the brachioradialis alone is acting. Are you able to follow what I'm saying? See, all muscles are still paralyzed, but brachioradialis is still acting. Then it is again the nerve is recovering, or the motor march is still happening. So that is how you assess recovery. So if you are able to assure yourself that the patient is recovering, then you definitely wait until full recovery. But if there is no recovery, then you can go and do an EMG, which we have discussed previously. See, in EMG, if you're able to get active potentials, it is only neuropraxia again. But like I said earlier, if it is denervation potential, it indicates a total loss of the conduction, and that case you should go for nerve exploration. After nerve exploration, you go back here, you again splint and wait, right? And this cycle continues. If suppose on nerve exploration, if you see that the nerve is intact, it again goes here, you splint and wait. But if it is damaged, you repair it. If the damage is such an extent that there is no gap between the ends, you do a primary repair. Otherwise, you do a gap grafting and you wait till recovery. From this point, you just go on here. You can just follow the arrows. It goes on here. You splint and wait again. And this cycle continues until the end stage is either full recovery or incomplete recovery. If it is full recovery, nothing needs to be done. If it is incomplete recovery, then we go to the salvage options, which are the tendon transfer. Which muscle has recovered, you leave it alone. Which muscle has not recovered, you do appropriate tendon transfers. With this one slide, I think we can have an overall picture of the management. And see, one important point is here. Maximum waiting time is 2 years, like I said earlier, because if the axon doesn't reach its target organ by 2 years, the muscle would have totally become fibrous. Then there won't be any useful muscle fibers at all. We can wait for a maximum period of 2 years. Beyond that, there is no use. You directly go to the salvage options. Hope I have summarized it. Any doubts in management? Sorry. Anybody wants anything to get clarified in management? There is one more comment in the chat box. Any doubts in the management part? Or anything else? Any doubt anywhere else? Shall we stop screen sharing so that we can have a picture of all of us? Shall I, anybody wants to see some of these slides, or shall I stop sharing? Okay, so I'll stop share. Fine. Anybody wants to discuss anything else, you can have a live chat now. Or can anybody give me a feedback about the class? How was it? Was it boring? Was it interesting? Was it confusing? Was it too fast? Even criticize me so that I'll improve on my next class.
It was interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And what else do you want to improve on this? Like we can have some videos as well. I'll try to get some videos for the next class. The problem is orthopedics and any other clinical subjects. It is always better to have a live patient in front of us while we have some discussions. The online platform lacks that. So we can try to compensate it by having some videos. I'll try to incorporate some more videos on the next class. Or any other thing you feel you need some more points, or whichever area you feel to be stressed upon, I can spend more time on. The next class, I think, will be taken by another author, Dr. Satish. He is an assistant professor from Stanley. He will discuss on bone tumors, and then again we have a hand surgeon. He will be discussing on non-union, Dr. Vindesh, and I will come back after those two classes. And in that class, we will be discussing ulnar and median. Somebody has appreciated me for the clinical demonstration. Thank you. Because I should act like the patient, because we could have a patient. If you want, I think you can get my contact number from your representative. If you have any other personal doubts, you can also text me. We can have a discussion. So many appreciations. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Somebody wants to say something? Somebody is asking, pushing Tyndall sign is only for ulnar or for all nerves? Tyndall sign is for all nerves, not only ulnar. The picture showed ulnar, no, for the purpose of understanding, but it is for all nerves. If you know the surface anatomy of that particular nerve, you should tap along the course of the nerve. But remember, you should tap distal to proximal, not proximal to distal. Most of them belong to the final. Do we have pre-final year students as well? Santosh, are you online?
Oh, yes, sir.
So, what are the major share of students today, pre-final or final?
Sir, final year, sir. Final year and some from pre-final and second year.
Good. Okay. Because if you have this understanding and then you examine real patients, it will be very easy to get the concepts. Once you see a patient, you understand how to do clinical examination, how to arrive at the examination, and when you know how to give a reasonable management plan, that is what needed in the exam. That is more than enough. See, you can't say I will go directly operate on a patient who only has neuroplasty. That will be a blunder, right? And the examiner won't forgive that. You just need to analyze what is the pattern of injury. It's not necessary to give a very exact location as well. See, the high nerve palsy can happen even proximal to the spiral groove, but still lower than the axilla. So it's not necessary that it should happen exactly at the level of spiral groove. Confusing concepts can occur, but most based on these drops and sensation which we discussed earlier, you will be able to arrive what is the clinical classification, whether it's low, whether it's high, or whether it's very high, and a reasonable plan based on it. That alone will. Nothing else is, nothing more is required in the exams. This will do.
Okay, sir.
So many appreciations. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It motivates me a lot. I'll improve on my future classes as well. We'll wait for another few minutes and then I think we can close the meeting if there are no more doubts.